Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, December 28th, 2023. It is such a privilege for me to be able to be with you tonight. I've been looking forward to this all week, and I am grateful to every single one of you for taking the time to join so that we could study together. In 1974, the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, gave a momentous lecture. Now, the entire presentation is magnificent, but I hope to share with you tonight just a short part of it that relates to this week's Torah portion. Hopefully, we will find another time to explore the rest of this magnificent lecture. It was not until 1980 that I first had the privilege to hear in person the Rav speak. I heard this as a recording from which I wrote out a transcript. And I will try, as audacious and perhaps foolish as it is, I will try as much as I can to use the Rav's exact words. What I cannot do is to convey the evocative and dramatic quality of his voice. To listen to him speak, his emphases, his pauses, his dramatic flourishes, that was an unforgettable experience and a significant component to the overall impact of his teaching. So I cannot do that. But I want you to know, though I cannot transmit that haunting voice to you, I am hearing it. I am hearing the Rav's voice in my head as I speak to you. There is a special relationship between a grandfather, grandmother, and a grandchild. In order to understand fully the unique character of this relationship, you have to be in one. You have to be a grandparent yourself. Whenever this kind of relationship is established, it transcends in emotional intensity and intellectual closeness even the parent-child relationship. It is by far stronger in many ways. This unique love of a grandchild and a grandparent is a typically Jewish experience. Psychologically, normally, concern for a grandchild should not reach the peak of passion and ecstatic love which a parent feels for a child. That would seem to be the closest. And with the greater discrepancy in years, that would normally diminish the intensity of the commitment. But it is different among our people. And that is due to a singular existential awareness, namely the awareness of the Masorah community. That means the transmission of Jewish teaching and Torah laws and wisdom from one generation to the next. Of our three forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, our history has bestowed upon Yaakov three prerogatives denied to either his father or his grandfather. The first is that Yaakov has two names, Yaakov and the name Yisrael. And both of those names become the generic term of the nation. Of course, we know ourselves as Yisrael, after our forefather Yaakov, and even the name Yaakov, the phrase is often used, Beis Yaakov, Beit Yaakov, the house of Yaakov, to refer to the entire Jewish people. Avraham, his name remains the name of an individual. Yitzchak, his name remains the name of an individual. Only the name of Yaakov, or Yisrael, expresses the collective of the entire Jewish people. That's number one. Number two, our rabbis in the Midrash point out that Yaakov is also referred to as Yisrael Saba, old Israel. Yisrael or Yaakov the Saba, the old man, or in modern Hebrew, the grandfather. Yisrael Saba. And number three, in our Torah portion, we learn B'cha Yevarech Yisrael Lemor. Yaakov says that the blessing that he gives to his two grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, will be the blessing by which all of Israel will bless their children. This is Birchas Habanim, the parents' blessing. It comes from our Torah portion. Yesimcha Elokim ki Ephraim elchem Manasseh. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Yaakov was speaking to his two grandchildren when he said those words. And the blessing we give to our daughters and granddaughters, Yisimech Elihim Kesara Rivka Rachav Leah. May God make you like the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. This is the blessing that parents give to their children. Many of us give this blessing every Friday night. So why don't we bless our children with, for example, the blessing that Yitzchak gave Yaakov? We know that blessing. In what way did Yaakov distinguish himself in order to deserve that his blessing should be the blessing that all Jewish people give to their children and their grandchildren? And also, why is it specifically the blessing that Yaakov gave to his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons of Yosef? Why not give one of the blessings he gave to his children, which is central to this week's Torah portion? Yaakov gives a bracha to each of his children. And the answer, says the Rav, is simple. Because this blessing of Yaakov is the only bracha that is given by a grandparent to a grandchild. Yaakov established contact and communication between himself and his grandchildren. Yaakov's relationship with Ephraim and Manasseh, it was a relationship that would be described as an I-thou relationship, a direct first-person relationship. Yaakov needed no interpreter. For example, his son Yosef, who was allegedly closer to Yosef's children. Yaakov did not need an interpreter to speak to his grandchildren. He didn't need a broker or a mediator. He engaged Ephraim and Manasseh in a dialogue. He leaped over the gap of generations. He transmitted the great Masorah, the tradition of Avraham, straight from Avraham to Ephraim and Manasseh. Even though they were raised and educated in a different cultural milieu. There was a tremendous discrepancy in age. Nonetheless, the Zaken, the Saba, the grandfather, succeeded in establishing communication. The old man taught these boys directly. It was Yaakov who taught Ephraim and Manasseh, not Yosef, their father. He conversed with them. He played with them. He dreamt together with them. He laughed and danced together with them. He was a playmate, a pal, a co-dreamer, a co-searcher. Yaakov knew the secret of uniting generations. It is a secret. The Rav said, I know many people who are very intelligent and scholarly, inspired leaders, but they cannot bridge the gap of generations. Yaakov knew the secret of the intermingling of young and old. He discovered a secret language which all Jews of all generations would understand. And if a grandfather can establish a liaison with a grandson, then so can a great-grandfather. And that means the line of communication is endless, boundless. And our hope for redemption is dependent on this ability. So the bracha, the blessing that Yaakov gives to his grandsons Ephraim and Manasseh, is the connection of the generations, the connection that leads us to the ultimate redemption of Israel. At this point, the Rav told a story about himself, which I will share with you. It is one of the most indelible and enduring images Rav Soloveitchik ever created in his teaching. He said as follows, I don't mean to boast, but for me this is not theory. It is my experience to unite, to merge many generations into one community, where the discrepancy of age disappears, where years play no role, have no significance, where generations communicate with each other. I experience this, he said, every time I enter the classroom at Yeshiva University. As you know, you may know, Rav Soloveitchik was perhaps the foremost teacher of Talmud in the modern era, and the bulk of his teaching was in the classroom at Yeshiva University in New York, where for decades he delivered what was probably not only the highest, most compelling, most intellectually rich Talmudic discussion at Yeshiva University, but perhaps in the world. So he tells the story, I experience this every time I enter the classroom, crowded with boys who could be, as far as ages are concerned, my grandchildren. I enter the class an old man with a wrinkled face, my eyes reflecting the fatigue and sadness of old age. You have to be old to experience that sadness. It is the melancholy of remembering things which have disappeared, which no longer exist. I sit down. Opposite me are rows of boys with beaming faces and clear eyes, radiating the joy of being young. I enter in a pessimistic mood, in despair. I ask myself, can there be dialogue between an old teacher and young students? Between a teacher in his Indian summer and boys enjoying the spring of their lives? I begin the class, and the door opens. Another old man walks in and sits down. He is older than me. He is the Rambam, Maimonides. Then more visitors enter. Rashi, Rabbi Akiva, more and more come in. I introduce them to my students through their words of commentary and understanding of the Talmudic literature, and the dialogue commences. The Rambam speaks. The Ravid, a contemporary, disagrees, sometimes sharply with harsh language. A boy in the class jumps up to defend the Rambam against the Ravid. He is very fresh, as boys are. And I respond to him. And suddenly, in this elevated Talmudic discussion of quoting scholars from every generation, a symposium of the generations comes into existence, and there is no end. All generations are somehow connected. We all speak one language. We all pursue one goal to understand and come closer to God's wisdom. We are all committed to a common vision. We all operate with the same categories. There is a Masorah, transmission of tradition, collegiality. V'hu haketz. And this expresses the end of days. This unity of generations, this march of centuries, this conversation, dialogue of past, present, and future will finally bring redemption. At the conclusion of 3 or 4 hours of the lecture, I am young. I feel elated, younger than my students. I have defeated age. I stand in awe of the great miracle of the rendezvous of generations. I am communicating with a new generation. The discrepancy of years is tremendous. However, we act in the spirit of Yaakov. We extend a hand over the gap of generations, and hands, no matter how different, one wrinkled and cold, the other smooth and warm, shake, unite in a community where this great dialogue of the transmission of Torah and connection to God continues. Let me just add, you and I are part of this community, this dialogue of past, present, and future. You and I now participate in the great miracle of the rendezvous of generations, which leads to the redemption of Israel. Let me share a second piece with you tonight, based on the writing of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Rabbi Sacks points out that if you want to understand what a book is about, look carefully at how it ends. This week's Torah portion, the Parsha VaYechi, that we've been discussing, is the end, the last portion of the book of Bereishit, the first of the 5 books of the Torah. If you want to understand the entire work of Bereishit, of Genesis, look carefully at our Torah portion at the end. And our portion has three deeply significant scenes. First, Yaakov blesses his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. We just discussed this, the bracha, the blessing that many parents give their children every Friday night. Second, Yaakov blesses his 12 sons. Now, there is a tension in these blessings. His blessing to the first three sons, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, read more like curses than blessings. But it's the fact that Yaakov is blessing all 12 of them together in the same room at the same time that is unique. We have not seen this before in the Torah. There is no record of Avraham blessing either Yishmael or Yitzchak. Yes, famously, Yitzchak blesses Esav and Yaakov separately. The mere fact that Yaakov is able to gather his sons together is unprecedented. We have not seen this scene in the Torah yet. And it's very, very telling, because in the next chapter, the beginning of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, we are described for the first time as a people. It's only because we achieved being able to live together as a family in this week's Torah portion that we could then begin to live together as a people in next week's Torah portion. And the third significant scene after the death of Yaakov, the brothers ask Yosef to forgive them. We discussed this last week, and what I'm going to share now is a different approach to this passage. Remember, we mentioned that the brothers had already done this in last week's Torah portion, Vayigash, and Yosef forgave them there. Presumably, it's repeated after the death of Yaakov, because the brothers presumably were afraid that maybe Yosef didn't really mean it when he said he forgave them in last week's Torah portion. He was just waiting until his father died, until Yaakov died. He didn't want to do anything that would cause his father any more pain. And maybe after Yaakov died, that was the time that Yosef was going to take his retribution on his brothers for the terrible things they did to him. And they ask his forgiveness. And Yosef speaks directly to their fears and puts them at rest. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Those are the three scenes with the book of Bereishit ends. And Rabbi Sacks says, the Torah is telling us an unexpected message. The family comes before everything else. It comes before the land, the nation. It comes before politics. It comes before economics. It comes before the pursuit of power, the accumulation of wealth. From an external point of view, the impressive story is that Yosef reached this high point of power in Egypt, second in command only to Paro. And he was so highly respected that when his father Yaakov died, even the Egyptians mourned his passing. But that's just the externality. Because when we turn the page and we begin the book of Shemot next week, we discover that the position of the Jews in Egypt was very vulnerable. And it changed for the worse quite dramatically. And in fact, the power that Yosef had accumulated would eventually be used against them. So Bereishit is not about power. It's about family. Because that is where life together begins. Now, the Torah does not mean to imply that there's anything easy about making or sustaining a family. Our patriarchs and our matriarchs, especially Sarah and Rivka and Rachel, they knew the agony of infertility. They knew what it was to hope and to wait and to wait again. Sibling rivalry is a repeated theme in this book of the Torah. We've discussed it a number of times. You know, the famous line in Tehillim that we love to sing, Hine matovim anoyim sheves achim gam yochad, for brothers and sisters to live together peacefully. How good is it? How pleasant is it? We could add the words, and how rare is it? Almost from the beginning of Bereishit, Cain kills Hevel, tensions between Sarah and Hagar, Yitzchak and Yishmael, Yaakov and Esav, Yosef and his brothers, which almost comes to murder. And yet, there is no diminution of the significance of the family. To the contrary, it is the main vehicle of blessing. It's as if the Torah is telling us with great honesty that yes, families are challenging. The relationship between husband and wife, between parent and child, is rarely straightforward. But we have to work at it. There's no guarantee we'll always get it right. It's by no means clear, we've discussed this a number of times, it's by no means clear that the parents in the book of Bereishit got it right. But this is our most human institution. James Q. Wilson, famous political scientist, wrote, "The family is an arena in which conflicts occur and must be managed. People within the family love and quarrel, share and sulk, please and disappoint. Families," he writes, "are the world in which we shape and manage our emotions." So the book of Bereishit is not a cliche, a platitude, a hymn to the virtue of families. It is a candid, honest, fully worked through account of what it is to confront some of the main problems within families, even the best of families. And so Bereishit, this book, the first of the 5 books of the Torah, ends with these 3 important resolutions. Number 1, that grandparents are part of the family and their blessing is important. And we saw how deep this is from the Rav. Number 2, Yaakov shows it is possible to bless all of your children, even if you have a fractured relationship with some of them. And number 3, Yosef shows it is possible to forgive your siblings, even if they have done you great harm. That surprisingly is what Bereishit is about. It's not about the creation of the world. That occupies only the first chapter. Bereishit, the book of Genesis, is about how to handle family conflict. And by the end of our Torah portion, as soon as Abraham's descendants, Yaakov and his family, can create a strong family, then they can move from Bereishit to Shemot, from Genesis to Exodus, and their birth, our birth, as a nation. My friends, I wish you a beautiful evening and a great Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.